shall we get started? Okay, then welcome everybody to the public lecture series on corporate due diligence obligations in the agri-food sector. My name is Christine Wieck. I'm a professor for agricultural and food policy at the University of Hohenheim, and I'm today going to moderate this session on the trade link. Let me introduce briefly what's the background of this public lecture series. Everybody who is attending this on a regular basis will know that already. But for all others, there is a scientific advisory board on agricultural policy, food and consumer health protection that's working for the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. The scientific advisory board is totally independent, scientifically independent, and also chooses its topic by itself. And one of the topics that we have chosen about 2 years ago was the topic of due diligence regulations in the agri-food sector. And the result of that occupation was that we came up with a report on due diligence obligations. The report was published in December 2023 and was handed over to the German Minister of Food and Agriculture. And now, working on the topic, we organized this lecture series together with very distinguished speakers from different branches that are involved in due diligence topics in order to make the report more public and in order to provide a forum for dialogue and discussion about these very challenging regulations. As you may know, there is a rise of corporate due diligence regulations in Europe and across beyond around the world. And in Germany, it started with the German Supply Chain Act. Then at the EU level, there was the regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, which is now in the process of being implemented. And just recently, the final vote on this EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence took place. And it will also be implemented in the next years. And there is a shifting responsibility to companies to look into their supply chains. The debate around that is rather long-standing. It started with food safety issues, but now we are very strongly into environmental topics with deforestation topics, but also human rights topics, because child labor and other things, because there are well-known figures from the International Labour Organization and UNICEF that there's still, in particular in the agri-food sector, there's still a high risk of human rights abuses, precarious working conditions, and also the environmental costs remain very high. And these due diligence regulations can be used as entry points or should be used as entry points to improve the situation in global agri-food supply chains, but the implementation is challenging. And in our report, we tried to focus on entry points that could make the implementation successful. Next slide, please. And as you can see, there are many different perspectives on these due diligence regulations. That's something that we figured out while working on our assessment. We started with a business perspective, with a management perspective, but then we realized we have to look at the administrative side. We have to look at the whole foreign trade topic, not just from a trade flow perspective, standards perspective, but also in terms of international relations and also in terms of policy coherence across different fields. And because the objective needs to be that they become due diligence regulations, deliver progress for human rights and the environment. And with this lecture series now, we try to focus on these different topics. And today we have two distinguished speakers for focusing on due diligence regulations and the interplay with trade policy. And we will start with Dr. Bettina Rudloff from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Bettina was also an external co-author of the report, specifically for this due diligence topic. she is very knowledgeable on that, has published many papers around trade policy and all kinds of regulatory issues. She has an agricultural economics degree from the University of Bonn, and since more than 10 years, she is now a senior policy advisor at this Chancellor Financed Institute for International and Security Affairs. Bettina will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we have John Clarke. I will introduce him later with his impressive CV, but he will be the second speaker, focusing from a more political advisor perspective on due diligence and trade policy. Please, Bettina, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm very happy to once again join this interesting series. So I hope you can now see the slides. It says yes, and the only thing is whether it's paging. Not in my case. I don't know, we just tested it and it was functioning. So now I can't. Oh,
Next slide.
No, that's not functioning. Shit, sorry. It all worked just a minute ago. Okay, wait, I tried something else. Sorry for that. So, because now that's a different, so can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, because, yeah, now it's going. Okay, thank you very much. So, the title was Can Trade Policy and Due Diligence Regulations Go Hand in Hand? And I was a bit provoked by doing a session jointly with such a first interesting and British colleague, John Clarke, which always suggests becoming very entertaining with a British colleague. So that provoked me a bit on a short subtitle asking, or do monsters fight with bare hands instead, going hand in hand? And the monsters you could see here should symbolize left side the paper tiger and right side the bureaucracy monster. Both, let's say, monsters often are linked to the recent due diligence approaches. Christina already showed this picture, which shows the different perspectives we in generally applied to assessing due diligence. The idea was to really have a comprehensive picture on these indeed very complex approaches of due diligence. And for today's session, we focus a bit, let's say, on these three perspectives, which is on foreign trade, overall policy, and international relations. And then for the whole report, the recommendations were defined along the line of these, let's say, three major areas of recommendations, which is first on the effective design and implementation, second on the policy environment, and third on the systematic development. And for today's issue, basically the recommendations refer to the area of the policy environment. Christine as well said already some words to somehow integrate the due diligence into the overall pattern or picture of what are in general possible trade-related measures. First of all, on the left side, we all know the classical tariffs. And then there is, let's say, the counterpart, each and anything which is non-tariff, which can refer to standards. And they can be first designed voluntarily or second mandatorily. On voluntary, again, you could or you see some private standards, for instance, by Fair Trade or the Rainforest Alliance, and some public governmentally defined ones, which, however, are voluntarily to be applied, which could be the ones on organic production and labeling. And on the mandatory side, this is, because they are mandatory, public defined, so by governmental actors. as Christina said, on food safety, or as well on certain required labeling requirements. And to this part of mandatory approaches belong now the new due diligence approaches. So what is, for these new approaches, as I always say, what is actually new? So first of all, they are mandatory and enforceable. That's relevant, maybe related later to some classical trade measures, part of trade agreements. The entry point is the business actor. Christina said that already. So the business actor in the, let's say, European territory or regulatory territory is the one addressed primarily, but then the general reach out goes along the value chain and as well internationally. And that could be upstream, basically. That means in the value chain, the delivering actors, and sometimes as well downstream. They are as well what we called unilateral or autonomous. That concerns, let's say, the relation to the trade partners. Different from trade agreements, the EU has set and defined these measures. And this unilateralism or unilateral measures, that's a kind of a new tendency, not only related to agriculture relevant initiatives, but in general. And this is just a selection of some European, quite new, so basically within the period of the still of this phase of the Commission, so since 2019. And you see in the top part of this table, the white marked part, generally applied measures. That means not referring to sustainability, not referring to agriculture, but generally. For instance, the anti-coercion instruments. And these general instruments are a bit to be seen in the scenery of a changed overall economic scenery. So a bit in the scenery of reacting on other countries' measures, even on protectionist measures. The green part symbolizes at the bottom of the table the measures linked to sustainability, for instance, the import ban for products from forced labor, but as well the quite known carbon border adjustments mechanisms, the CBAM. And the last three ones are now the due diligence approaches. First of all, the deforestation-free supply chain, UDR, the due diligence, directive EUCS-DDD, and one other example is the German Supply Chain Act. So what that should show is that these approaches are part of a general approach of a unilateral setting of measures in parallel to still ongoing bilateral free trade negotiations. What are reasons for this new approach? There are different perspectives, again, for finding arguments. One is out of the international law argumentation. The first one is on human rights, for which the state, so the governmental actor, has a responsibility to protect human rights. And this responsibility encompasses as well private companies' actions. So not only vis-a-vis other state actors, but as well private actors. And there's a long history on respective multilateral ruling. You can see that at the right side. That only should visualize that already in the year 2000 at UN level, respective initiatives started. So even though we have the impression that's all very new here in the EU, let's say the origin is a bit longer. There are as well ecological related aims in international law, which are bound to international commitments like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, or on climate, the Paris Convention. From the issue of, Christina said that let's say the substantial reasoning, one could say that regarding human rights, for instance, in the year 2021, the ILO and UNICEF assessed child labor at 160 million children, of which 70% takes place alone in agriculture. So agriculture plays a dominant role in violation of child labor. And on forestry, the global loss of forest is per year assessed at 10 million hectares, again, mainly for agriculture. So this is, let's say, a substantial reasoning specifically for agriculture, somehow to address these aims. Another more economic argument comes from the international competition argument, saying that if you look at the alternative of voluntary standards, there could be the risk of a race to the bottom, to pursue a comparative advantage. So in order to lower the standards in these highly competitive markets. And finally, maybe a newly or increasingly new arising issue for the EU at a geopolitical level is to support the acceptance to go forward with new trade agreements, losing a lot of acceptance internally in the EU, thinking about TTIP, thinking about the problems with CETA and as well with the EU-Mercosur agreement. This path of due diligence could be a kind of supporting way to support acceptance as well for trade agreements, meaning that we have these due diligence approaches which could follow sustainability. What we did in the scientific advisory board is we had some hypothetical scenarios, which first on the left side is linked to the process, in the middle to the market, and in the right side to the implementation. And there is always a, let's say, more negative scenario and a more positive scenario. So on the process, a positive scenario relevant for the international and trade effects is somehow to support cooperation and dialogue. And the market scenario to somehow support norm diffusion instead of segmentation of different value chains. And finally, on the implementation related dimension, to support stay and behave of companies in foreign markets instead of cut and run because of fearing that delivering countries couldn't fulfill certain requirements. So the idea is to politically support the red marked scenarios. Or in other words, coming back to my monsters, not only to avoid negative and to support positive scenarios, how to avoid bureaucratic monsters and paper tigers fighting with bare hands. And here they are again. So what could one politically do to tame the monsters? And one challenge is for taming the monsters, missing coherence. So what we could see across the due diligence approaches and as well the due diligence approaches compared to trade measures, we see a divergence in terms of the addressed objectives or the international conventions referred to, the type and size of actors addressed, the enforcement type. For instance, in one case, it's in the USCS DDD, in the end, it's civil liability as one issue to enforce. The degree of operational detail, which is in the EUDR, so on deforestation, very, very high. Then the starting time and the idea, is there a transitional phase or not? That is very divergent. And what does that mean? That could could lead to high implementation costs, and it could bear the risk to lose acceptance of actors and countries. I'm not going to the details. It's just to show visually where are the differences. And you could find this table in the whole report. It shows in the middle part the UCS DDD, so the horizontal initiative for each and any sector and as well agricultural, but not specific on agriculture, and right side the EUDR. And for instance, it's just marked here that in the UCS DDD, it's basically upstream, but there are some downstream elements as well. That means the responsibility of an actor, so a company, reaches as well when the product is sold to the next step, but that's limited for some recycling activities. Whereas, for instance, in the UDR, it's only upstream, but in the UDR, it's very, very detailed, operationalized in the terms of really geolocalization at a very small part of a farm size. And there are some other differences. I'm not going through this now. What I wanted to show you instead, again, only to visualize not only the differences across or between the due diligence approaches, but as well compared to trade approaches. And what you see here is, at the left side, different conventions, for instance, from the ILO, or some on governance, and at the bottom part as well on environmental issues. And it's just a selection. The whole table in our report is, I forgot, maybe 15 pages or so. So we really went through each and any convention which is referred to in one or the other frame. So that's at the left side, all conventions where we have a linkage to the regime or to the initiative. And at the right side, we have now the different regimes or measures or initiatives. For instance, the first one is a classical bilateral trade agreement, one of the youngest of the EU, with New Zealand. And in these trade agreements, you cover these conventions in the TSD chapter, which are the Trade and Sustainable Development chapters. And then the next one are unilateral measures. And the first unilateral package is vis-a-vis trade or vis-a-vis the global south. So they are unilateral preferences under what is called the General System of Preferences, or the EBA, Everything But Arms. And there's an additional type of it called GSP+. And they are only valid for a defined number of countries. And then at the very right, again, the 3 due diligence regulations. So, and all these you will see refer now to different type of conventions. And first, they all have different mechanism of enforceability. Looking at a classical trade agreement, like the New Zealand ones, or maybe in the future the EU-Mercosur one, we have usually dispute mechanism for the whole agreements. However, specifically the TSD chapter relevant for all these sustainability conventions usually is excluded from the dispute mechanism, which could in the end, in terms of violation, increase or allow for increasing tariffs. They are now the newer ones with New Zealand, where we have that in limited ways. I show you that. The other, the unilateral agreements vis-a-vis developing countries, doesn't look at sanctions, but instead preferences, saying if you fulfill these conventions, then you are offered better tariffs, up to even 0 tariffs like under the EBA. And then the due diligence approaches, which kind of differently across the ones have either civil liability in the case of CS DDD, different types of penalties, and all together have market access restrictions by the companies saying, okay, we fear or we see that if there's no fulfilling of this convention, then a certain delivering actor has to escape the value chain. So, and if you now look what type of convention is linked to, you see a quite colorful picture, which means everything marked means there is a link, and you see immediately it's different. So the coverage is different. So there could be an actor which is addressed differently by the due diligence regulation than under a certain trade agreement, for instance. And the next, what you see is there are blue colors and green colors. And the blue one means an enforceability. So you see, for instance, in the trade agreement, it's more green. So it's less enforceable. It's just in the New Zealand type only for a selected case of convention. So that means altogether, we have a problem with coherence. And that's my final slide saying, what does that all mean, or what were our recommendations? And the major recommendation is in the middle part, as I said already, on the policy environment. However, I would like as well to repeat one of the other area of recommendations on effective design and implementation, as that is a kind of horizontal recommendation. So we really strongly emphasize, because it's a new type of regulation where we all don't have, so all means the states, the controlling authority, and even the companies actors do not have much experiences yet, that we strongly recommend to establish a learning system, or to allow for learning altogether. What could that mean? To establish a platform to exchange experiences, to really make use of scope for flexibility wherever it's possible. And in the major part on the policy environment, we strongly recommend to ensure coherence, to offer flexibility within the package. So a delivering partner country does not only see the due diligence approaches affecting its delivery actors, but as well a trade agreement. That is all now the Mercosur dilemma, where that's a problem, because the Mercosur countries see the whole package together. So to find some options for more flexibility. Then, of course, bilateral dialogue is specific, because that's unilateral measures, and to support the implementation. And of the third area of recommendation, maybe one recommendation to be said is impact assessment is very, very important and should be done from the very first moment, whether and how all these due diligence approaches affect countries, and even in unintended ways, like on small farmers. I stop here, and I'm happy now to hear what is John saying, who just disappeared, but he's coming back. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks very much for kindly inviting me. Oh, sorry, Christine, you wanted to...
yes, sure. Give me 1 minute to introduce you properly, and thank Bettina already for the nice presentation. And to the audience, as somebody has already done it, please feel free to start typing questions into the Q&A section. But later on, you can also raise your hand and just vocal your question directly. But you can also put already questions into the chat. And with this, I would like to introduce John Clarke, who is a former Director for International Relations at the DG Agriculture in the European Commission. You have, if I'm correct, you have retired last year, and since then you are even more busy than before, I would assume, because you are very engaged in journalism, university teaching, and consultancy. And before starting at the European Commission, you have been the head to the EU delegation to the WTO, and you have worked in Geneva. And you have joined the European Commission in 1993 as a trade negotiator. And so I'm sure what Bettina has now told us, you have probably negotiated all these agreements, and you can probably tell us much more about what was the background, why the trade regimes came out as they were. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Bettina. I hope I'm audible. I'll start with a disclaimer. As you said, I don't work for the European Union anymore. So as they say at the beginning of a movie, if anything I say bears any resemblance to any EU policy, living or dead, it's a pure coincidence. I'm going to share with you some thoughts on the way in which the EU's trade and sustainability agenda has evolved over the years, and then try to place the new Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, in the overall ecosystem that was described by Dr. Rudloff, by Bettina. And I'll follow the approach of the Roman god Janus in looking in two directions, both backwards at the recent past and forwards into the future. Now, when I joined the European Commission 30 years ago, we had a very clear policy of what's in the Bible called noli me tangere. Do not let trade policy get polluted by non-trade objectives. Trade policy is an end in itself, not a means to an end. One commissioner said, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So we tried very hard, for reasons which I don't have time to explain, we tried very hard to keep other policy areas out of trade policy. That, of course, changed over the years. There was progressively, there was no eureka moment, but I think a turning point was the WTO ministerial meeting in Seattle in 1999, which collapsed in part due to allegations from NGOs and unions that international trade rules rode roughshod or ignored or were detrimental to human rights and the environment. And the Seattle meeting collapsed with some private USA support over that, those NGO concerns. Now, whether the NGOs were right or not is not the question, but the upshot of Seattle was that it became very clear to the EU and others that trade agreements, whether in WTO or bilaterally, would only get approved by parliaments and the public if they demonstrably supported sustainable development. And that became a red thread in European Union trade policy from Seattle. It was strengthened with the Lisbon Treaty, which enshrined in law the Union's obligation to try to internationalize sustainability in its different international relations. And of course, Bettina mentioned the SDGs, which gave a further encouragement to that direction. And so what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years is in the area of FTAs and autonomous instruments, a repurposing, and particularly in free trade agreements. They have now been very much repurposed to have increasingly comprehensive and binding obligations on sustainability. The Bettina's presentation noted the EU-New Zealand agreement, which is the state-of-the-art or the apogee, the apotheosis of a high-level agreement where there are binding commitments on human rights, labor conventions, biodiversity, gender, indigenous rights, environment, climate change, animal welfare, binding commitments subject to dispute settlement and the withdrawal of market access concessions in the event of non-compliance. This is quite a stringent set of obligations, even more stringent than the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement that was negotiated a couple of years earlier. And it was interesting that when the New Zealand agreement was adopted in the European Parliament, the usually very protectionist Agricultural Committee, they welcomed it with open arms as being a very modern, state-of-the-art, green, sustainable agreement. In parallel to this, these increases in sustainability in trade agreements, as Bettina Rudloff pointed out, there have been a whole deluge of autonomous regulations with comparable objectives. I use the word autonomous because in WTO language, autonomous is good, whereas unilateral is bad. So I call them autonomous instruments. And in particular, I think particularly relevant for this afternoon are the CBAM, the deforestation regulation, the forced labour regulation, and of course our new friend, the new kid on the block, the CSDDD on corporate due diligence, which to my astonishment was adopted by the European Parliament at its last session. So, is this the future? No, it's not. I think we're seeing already a lot of pushback from our partners, both in the FTA space and in the area of these autonomous instruments. New Zealand FTA will not be the model or the template for the different negotiations now being undertaken with India, Indonesia, Mexico, Mercosur, even Australia. And why is that? Well, simply these countries are not prepared to sign on such high-level binding commitments subject to dispute settlement and the withdrawal of trade concessions for different reasons. I think in the case of a country like Indonesia, they fear that they cannot meet those substantive commitments, and they don't want to be penalized for their inability to meet them. In the case of India, I think they have a very strong opposition in principle to what they see as the imposition of Western standards, and this is for them a too great intrusion into their sovereign space, their sovereignty, and in an election year, particularly sensitive. So India will not, under any circumstance, be willing in an FTA to take on the same kind of obligations that New Zealand did. And then there's a third group of countries, I think Australia is one, who could probably take on board all of these commitments, but they're not being paid enough in return for doing so in the agreements. They're not being given enough beef or sugar or rice. So they, why should we bother shouldering all these onerous commitments if we're not being paid for it? So the FTA agenda, I think, has basically run out of road when it comes to sustainability. And the Commission Vice President Dombrovskis, who is the Trade Commissioner, has effectively recognised that. In a recent speech, he admitted that the sustainable chapters of the FTAs in New Zealand is too much for many people, and the EU will have to moderate its ambitions, lower its ambition if it wants to achieve anything with these more difficult emerging economies and others. And I think we're seeing also, or we will see, a similar pushback when it comes to the autonomous instruments, in particular CBAM, deforestation, and the CSDDD. Already today in the WTO, there's a coalition of countries who are very concerned about the deforestation regulation. It includes USA, Canada, so not just developing countries, India, Indonesia, Brazil, of course, Thailand, etc. And they are threatening dispute settlement if this agreement, if this regulation is not implemented in an extremely fair manner. And they've so far have no evidence to show that it would be. So I think we are going to get into some real difficulties, at least at the implementation stage of these autonomous instruments, because, as I said, a number of countries are already extremely concerned about the impact of these regulations on their trade, on their market access. And even those countries with whom we have negotiated and concluded and have enforced trade agreements consider that the EU is giving with one hand in the FTA, taking away with the other hand in deforestation. You know, for a country like, well, many countries, what is the value of a concession on beef or soya or palm oil if the product cannot be marketed in the first place because of the prohibition of the deforestation regulations? So I think we are looking at a difficult situation. although possibly a more right-wing European Parliament after June is likely to be less green, is likely to be less politically correct, if you like, and it's possible that a new European Parliament may be in favour of some relaxation or downgrading slightly of the stringency of these autonomous regulations. On the other hand, the next Parliament could be even more protectionist than ever, and much more focused on Europe's own industrial autonomy and independence. So it's difficult to know. Now, as regards the corporate due diligence directive, which, as I said, I was very surprised that the Parliament passed it at the last minute, even a watered-down version with much higher thresholds for coming under it. I see a lot of challenges ahead with this directive. First of all, implementation, as Dr. Rudloff suggested, is going to be incredibly complex. This is a massive endeavor. I mean, it takes hours and hours to read this directive. It's very, very complicated, very comprehensive. It leaves a lot of margin of interpretation, and I'll come back to that. So it's going to be very, very difficult in practice. And I speak from the point of view of a WTO, person who's been involved in WTO for decades. It'll be very, very challenging for the EU to implement this in a way which is consistent with WTO in terms of proportionality of the measure, in terms of transparency, in terms of, in particular, non-discrimination between different companies of the same size and with the same profile. So it's going to be very, very difficult to be non-discriminatory between firms and countries. So I think there is a possible risk of WTO litigation some way down the track in the future. A second challenge with this directive is that it's not 100% clear, at least to me, as to what one does in cases where there is overlapping legislation. So, what applies, the due diligence directive or the deforestation law or the forced labour regulation? There is in the directive the standard provision that the lex specialis applies to the extent of any divergence or difference, but that is not sufficient, I think, in legal terms to give enough guidance on how to implement and which set of rules is applicable in any given case. The third, I think, challenge of this directive is because it's a directive and not a regulation, and that means that, of course, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation by different member states. There's a German law on this. Some other member states may have laws on corporate due diligence, others don't yet have. And I can see, because of this very, very relatively wide margin of interpretation, which is typical of directives, there could be a race to the bottom between member states. Some member states may wish to interpret the directive in a very, very loose or lenient manner in order to minimize the competitive disadvantage given to their companies, if you like, compared to companies in other member states. And so I think it does give rise to some risks in terms of the harmonization and the good functioning of the single market, which I think is not to be underestimated. So at the very least, and I think I would agree with the recommendations that were put in Bettina Rudloff's presentation. In order to minimize the three risks I've described, there needs to be very, very clear implementation guidelines developed at union level, certainly. And there needs to be very, very robust, I think, European Commission oversight to avoid distortions to the single market due to differing interpretation and application and enforcement by different member states. That sounds fine in practice, but the experience that we've had so far with the deforestation regulation, which is now in force, does not give very many grounds for optimism. The Commission is severely understaffed. You may be surprised, the audience, to know that, but it really is. And there simply is not the manpower, the resources to carry out the kind of necessary cooperation with third countries who may be affected by these autonomous regulations. And there have been a lot of complaints already from third countries at the way in which the European Union is really not giving any resources or time or expertise or even financial support to help them meet these new onerous obligations. And I think it's only going to get worse, frankly, in the next few years when with more regulations coming down the pipeline and coming into force, first of all, and secondly, even greater pressures on the European Union budget because of the war in Ukraine and so on. So implementation is going to be a real challenge for that reason as well. I don't have any good news to share, but I think it's important to be give a dose of realism to the debate. And again, thank you very much for allowing me to share my rather sober thoughts with you.
Okay, thank you very much, John, also for your perspective. And yes, indeed, it was a little bit more careful and describing also from your internal perspective or your formerly internal perspective, to be correct. Yeah, some of the implementation challenges that are going to be coming in the future. And with this, I would like to open up the discussion. We have a very technical question. I will come back to that a little bit later. But maybe beforehand, I would like to ask you, John, again. You have started with Seattle, with the ministerial of the WTO in Seattle. That didn't work out. That was kind of my starting to get interested in trade policy. And I mean, since then, we have gone a tremendous way from focusing only on economic issues to opening up to sustainable development, food security, poverty. All these linkages to trade have been explored and wherever possible be included in trade agreements. And now you describe that we may have a move backwards. So how do you see that these things will evolve? Because the challenges, the social challenges, the socio-economic challenges, food security, they are not going away. They are even becoming worse. So how, and trade is the most important issue, or one of the most important supporting elements that could solve some of these issues. How do you see that this will evolve?
Well, this is, as the politicians say, I'm glad that you asked me that question. Very difficult to answer briefly, but what I expect to see is at least a slight slowing down and a slight dilution of these ambitious sustainability commitments, whether it's in free trade agreements or whether it's through the autonomous measures, which are in many respects a kind of trade instruments. I hope that there will not be a stop to this, because these are existential issues, especially climate change, and so we must press ahead. But we can only do it if we carry our major partners along with us. It's of no use the EU being the only part of the world which reaches climate neutrality in 2050, carbon neutrality in 2050, if the rest of the world does not match that, because we're only 9% of global emissions and reducing. So we cannot make the difference ourselves. So we have to get our partners on board. But if we push too hard and too fast and too stringently, they will walk away, as they are doing. Yeah. So I think there has to be some rebalancing done, but without, as it were, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that applies to human rights, labour, and the environment and climate. I think the human rights and labour space is easier to manage because there is it's less expensive to implement for countries who have issues, and there are more long-standing recognised international standards applicable in those areas. So I think it'll be a little less contentious. The real problem is going to be environment and climate change.
Yes.
But there's no turning back. There's no going back completely on trade policy. I mean, the genie is out of the bottle now, and it cannot be put back in. So, like it or not, trade policy will continue to be used to try to leverage non-trade goals. Trouble is, the EU is not as powerful internationally as it was. Yeah, I mean, 15 years ago, world's biggest economy, 510 million rich consumers. Now we've got we're competing with China, with the USA. The UK is out, and the EU is already a very open market. So there are fewer incentives now than ever for other countries to swallow, the kind of obligations that we're asking them to do.
Yes, thank you. And interesting that you mentioned the WTO and that there has a coalition formed implicitly that is working against it, because a couple of times WTO has been called like being a dead institution or an institution running out of a mandate. And it's interesting that you also, like Bettina, she's also always bringing up the WTO again, that it's still alive, it seems. But Bettina, you have raised your hand.
Yes, and we should not talk about the WTO as if she's not alive. So even if it's now a problem, what we expect to lose to, let's say, to escape the past from the WTO is larger than maybe the deficits are now, I would say. But that was just a side comment. I would like to benefit, John, from your long-term experience in, let's say, political communication. So what strikes me always is the issue of leakage or the risk of leakage in terms of, in the end, how to build up credibility of European policy. And I, as a researcher, I would say it's strongly linked to the question of impact assessment, to really soundly assess the effects, not only in a technical way, whether these or that requirements is certified, but whether really there's an effect on human rights and on deforestation, which is not deviated in a leakage effect. So what would be your answer on that? Because I really think it's a very difficult one.
Yeah, well, I think I mean, the issue of leakage is genuine. I mean, that's very clear. I gave the example now of greenhouse gas emissions. It's not enough that we reduce them; others have to do the same, and we have to find measures that will either incentivize or force that kind of the higher standards to be applied. So the evidence is there. I think that's very clear, and the impact assessments that always accompany EU legislation or FTAs shows that. But as they say in English, you can take a horse to the water, you can't force the horse to drink, and that's the problem we have with many of our partners, because they get a very mixed message from the European Union. On the one hand, they get a message: we want to cooperate with you to improve the global commons and our global environment for the sake of humanity. We've agreed to do this in Paris or wherever else. On the other hand, European farmers are saying we want a level playing field. We don't want environmental and socially dumped products. We want to be competitive, and these countries are getting an unfair advantage. So please impose more measures on them. The Macron mirror clauses being the extreme example, to remove the competitive advantage that they get unfairly in the view of European farmers. That is, of course, a disastrous message in terms of incentivizing third countries to raise their standards. And it's a disastrous message in terms of WTO, because that is a basically a WTO illegal argument, the level playing field. You would lose a dispute in WTO on that. And then thirdly, there's we are, or the EU is accused of being hypocritical. On the one hand, it is saying to the emerging economies, the developing world, you have to achieve certain climate action targets. But, and they're saying, well, you agreed to give us money for this, 100 billion a year. It's not coming, hasn't come. Yeah. It's fine for you to say this, you're a rich region, and historically you've been the biggest polluter by far. Yeah. Europe and North America. So please, give us a break. And I think that's not an easy argument to dismiss. Yeah. So I think certainly we need to have improved communication. We have to commit to our pledges to help finance the green transition in the developing world, as we promised to do. And there's a big international argument at the moment, you may know this, about whether those funding pledges are binding in international law or not under the Paris Agreement. And we need to completely evacuate this argument about leveling the playing field and taxing unfair imports.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions in the chat that go a little bit in not the same direction, but the question is, what would be more effective on the global market to push towards more sustainable standards, if not mandatory due diligence? I guess the background is because all countries committed to it over the Sustainable Development Goals, over ILO labor norms that have been signed by many, many countries. And I think also for me, or as Europeans, and that's also the position of the Scientific Advisory Board, it's no longer acceptable if we know that there's child labor in many of the products that we consume here on the European market. I mean, that's a real issue. And the second question goes a little bit in that direction, that the due diligence approach, which basically means that countries have to look into their value chains to identify potential risks, and how that could have been differently. Bettina, John, what are your perspectives on that?
Maybe just shortly to start. Yeah, to the first question, I mean, John already gave a broad picture on the issue. One point is there are commitments based on international law, okay, but let's say the political implementary reality has to be considered as well. So how could you really effectively enforce these conventions? And as John said, actually you need to somehow get the trade partners at your side, huh? And as a trade theory person, I would say, okay, the best way always is the multilateral way. You should have somehow came up with a multilateral setting on different standards, which is difficult, of course. So maybe it's not either or. So we now have started with these autonomous or unilateral. I use the term unilateral because I'm very much in the debate with the trade partners, and they always use the term unilateral. So more the nasty term, let's say, or the term that symbolizes the criticism, huh? And that's actually, maybe to answer it in this way, not so effective is the idea to unilaterally or autonomously push a certain standards on other countries, especially in what we may call a Zeitenwende or a change in overall economic settings. So the EU actually is losing market share towards many partner countries. And that means these, let's say, natural autonomous situation that we are the most dominant market, attractive for each and anybody. That's maybe not that dominant now and nowadays. For some products, yes, but not in general. And that's something one has to take into account, actually, in order to really enforce something. And just finally to the second question, what could have been done? That's what many trade partner countries complaining is to have been entered better into a bilateral dialogue beforehand. So yeah, I know the typical EU argument is then, yeah, but we have all these public consultation, which is true, and they took place, but there are kind of a more formalist idea, maybe that was not enough, actually. At least that's what I take away from the debates I'm involved in. And what one can do now is what John already touched upon, is trying to be more flexible in the whole package of the due diligence and potential future trade agreements. So maybe not to stress sanctionability still. So what is negotiated now within the idea from the Mercosur side to get away maybe from the sanctions? And I would say one could do that because we have now this idea of a strong enforcement via due diligence. So leave that out of the free trade agreements, be more generous maybe on market access. That's another issue. So especially on agriculture, a lot of trade partners say, you are still very rigid on a lot of TRQs on beef and so on. There, the issue is more internally, thinking about the French position, how one could convince very opposing European member states. And finally, maybe kind of subsidiarity as well, seen from the partner side. So they sometimes have their own certification schemes already in place. Couldn't one accept them? We are a kind of mutual acceptance idea. That's tricky, and one has to negotiate that, but that's again something countries complain very often, that it's not only the standard and the aim set, but even the type of certification. So each and any detail is coming from the EU. So maybe there could be more flexibility. So that's just what my experiences in the debate is.
Not much to add to that. I agree with everything that Bettina Rudloff has said. I think there are four important things that are coming out of this discussion. I think one is that in working with our trading partners, I mean, cooperation and not coercion must be the way forward. Yeah, and incentives and not penalties should be the way forward. The GSP is a good example of that. I think it's an incentive based, not a punitive system. So cooperation, not coercion, must be the watchword. Secondly, I would say that as Dr. Rudloff said, there needs to be much more systematic and genuine upstream consultation with third countries in advance of regulations being developed, and much earlier, so their views can be taken into account and give us a reality check. Thirdly, in some cases, slower implementation, more grace periods, more lead time, perhaps more exemptions for very small countries who don't make any kind of have any difference to the global environmental footprint, etc. And yes, equivalence and not harmonization is obviously a very good way forward as part of a more flexible approach to the implementation of what are extremely important and noble objectives. And then finally, yes, I mean, if the EU were willing to give better agricultural market access to developing countries, that would buy a lot of goodwill, and it would, in effect, pay for the cost to these countries of raising their production standards, having a proper enforcement system against child labour, and putting in place environmental technology and so on to reduce environmental damage or climate change. But you know, the EU in its wisdom has not made that kind of trade-off yet adequately, and nothing in life comes for free, and that is the question which I think the EU has to answer.
So thank you very much. So just to ask this again, so the due diligence approach in itself that companies have to follow now, and only the big ones, by the way. I mean, this is currently only imposed for the really, really big companies. That's not under question. That's considered still to be useful, but the question is how to support that better and how to engage with other countries' governments in order to support the approach. And if you
I think there needs to be a lot of partnership between member states and the Commission and some of the big companies who are going to fall under the scope of the regulation. Some of them are ahead of the regulation or the directive, like Vodafone, I think probably is. Others, Nestle, maybe not. You know, so I think it's that there's a lot of work needs to be done between government in Europe, government in third countries, and the companies themselves to make sure that they implement these due diligence requirements as in the way intended.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe also a little bit more time in implementation, because at least the EUDR, the deforestation regulation, there seems to be the requirements not yet ready in order to be put into force at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And there's another question: how can the EU gain powerful allies on the way towards trade and sustainability? And also, which allies do we need? What's the position of the US and China? I mean, we have elaborated a little bit on that in the report. And because the US also has due diligence regulation, China not yet, but China in terms of green transformation is also not everywhere totally lagging behind. So I think this is also something where one has to look very carefully where the different countries stand, because we have now in our master's program, we have now a course on policies for sustainability transition, and there our students always do case studies, mostly on their home countries, about labor rights, for example, minimum wages, and a lot is happening on the ground in many of these countries. The problem is that currently there is no equivalence, or it's difficult to connect that to the European approach and to the European system. And I think that's really something where more work should be done, and really to understand the position of potential partner countries.
Bettina, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, no, I can support that. However, that means, again, a lot of trust towards some partner countries has been destroyed. So one now has to be very careful. So if you, and it depends a bit on what type of sustainability issue we look at. If we look at forestation and we have the Amazonas territory there, the issue really is difficult now because so much had been really a problem regarding the past negotiation steps. So I would say one need now to be very sensible towards these countries, and actually, as Christina said, to look at, okay, what are your experiences? I mean, Brazil, for instance, is very proud of having the oldest forestry protection law. You could now debate whether that had been effective or not, but in legal terms, they have a historically very old forest protection law, and they are very proud of that. So again, trying to take them with us and ask them, what are your experiences? And they have several little projects, or not so little, even large projects. And they have a lot of experience. That what I mean always with subsidiarity, what is a huge internal principle for the EU, but one could follow that as well, or accept that for other countries, they have on the ground their own experiences. And that had been now a bit destroyed, this idea, bilaterally, but one should try to invest in this trust again to gain then allies. And yeah, with some countries that will be difficult, I can imagine. So India, I don't know what are your experience, John, but they have a very different approach as well, even language-wise. They often explain what they mean by sustainability. Or Brazil always stresses sustainability is as well social economic development. So these intercultural, how to say that, intelligence, this intercultural knowledge as well on what are different countries' connotations, not as an excuse, but really as a trial to try to understand each other. I think that's important.
No, that's absolutely true. Many developing countries have a very different calculus to that of Europe. Yeah, I mean, Europe, we have the luxury today to be able to focus on environmental protection and climate change, having destroyed our environment over the last, until a few years ago. Other countries, developing countries, West Africa is a good example, but also Latin America, as you suggest, their priority today, rightly or wrongly, is poverty reduction. Yeah, it's to actually avoid starving people, starvation, and environment polluting their local rivers or their soil takes a back seat to that. That's not the priority. I'm sure they would love it if it were, if they had the money to make it a priority, but they don't. So for them, they have a different calculus between the different pillars, if you like, of sustainability. And yes, we have to recognize that. And the only way to make progress is to work in good faith with other countries. As a negotiator, lesson 101, put yourself in the shoes of your partner. Yeah, look at it from their point of view. Because if you don't, you're not going to find a common ground. Yeah, and if we don't do that, then and countries continue going in different directions, then the only thing that will force a real change will be a major climate catastrophe in a few years' time. That may be the only thing that shakes countries up to really change, but I hope it will not get to that stage.
Yes, I guess we all can agree on that. But I think the debate here shows that, and I think this is really something that the due diligence legislation has generated, that this topic is much broader than just the focus on the business angle of companies looking into their value chains to avoid due diligence risk. But the topic that evolves around this corporate sustainability directive is a much broader one. And that's why we in the end came up with these different evaluation perspectives, because it's a much more complex topic and it touches very strongly on international relations and how to understand and how to work with partner countries.
Absolutely. And I congratulate you on that report, your report, for that reason. It's a very wise approach.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to come back now to the first question, the very technical one, where the question that companies that have to follow the CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that they will not be obliged to also report according to the CSDDD. And we have actually in the background Googled that again to make sure that our answer is correct. And I'm now, let's say 90%, 95% correct that actually this is not true, because the CSRD has a different objective. It's already being implemented. And it has a different objective in mind. It's about making reports more comparable. and the CSDDD, so the corporate the directive on corporate on due diligence. It's about risk assessment. It's about company risk assessment in their own value chain. And so these two reportings are very different from each other. They can be made coherent, that with a one report, you also at the same time report for CSRD, but the objectives are different, and that's why you cannot fulfill the one with the other. Because the CSDDD, the due diligence report, enforces countries who fall under the directive, which are very few companies currently, and it's only starting in 2 or 3 years with the implementation. They have to do this risk assessment along their value chain. And that's something completely different than what the CSRD focusing on. Okay, and I've heard that there is another question in the chat. I didn't see it.
It's from Christian Möller. Christian,
Okay.
maybe, but are you possible to ask it yourself? Could you unmute yourself?
Of course I can, yeah, but I just happened to be last time speaker and also, and now I'm still with the speaker link, so I'm sorry I'm in the wrong box, but then I don't have access to questions, only to answers. No, thank you. No, I think it was very interesting to see even, that's almost like a learning part. It's almost a comment as we try to bring the LKSG into Spain, EU member state, and they're of course knowing that now CSDDD is coming. They're still saying, hey, why are you with the German retailers enforcing these requirements on us? We have our whistleblower. We anyway have put up for many companies a complaints mechanism, and we're talking about grievance mechanism, which the German retailers will bring into the supply chain. And this is a risky supply chain, as you know, from the communication, etc. And there's a lot of evidence. And so the question even here was how to bring them along. And we haven't even spoken to the governments yet. It's just the companies that protect. We are in the EU. Why are you using a German law? So that's already something we can learn from, I think. Also, how we build now also the relationships with the same businesses and companies outside outside of the EU when we actually develop the implementation of the national member state parts. And they also need to, and that's the second part, definitely a recommendation we should stress very hard that when this has been adapted, also LKSG and the other one developed the implementation of the directive, that we really align this with the whistleblower protection law, in particular on the feedback mechanism. There we are really running into overlap, and we cannot expect from vulnerable people that should have a single and easy access to complaints to make a differentiation with channel of protection and with channel of complaints they use.
Yes, thank you. Also, again, very good example. First of all, why we need coherence across policies. And for this, in order to ensure the coherence, sometimes you need a little bit more time and not the hot needle in writing legislation. And it also shows why we need a European approach, at least in my perspective. And because these national approaches, in particular in a common market, is a big problem. But it also shows that we still have to work closely with important trading partners because we don't want to lose them. Okay, let's make a final round of comments, Bettina and then John, and then I guess if there are no more questions popping up, we can move on.
But I had another question.
Okay, then go ahead. We still have some time.
I have a question for John, because it came to my mind looking at different countries' approaches, so not only the EU. Often I hear that the British, the UK deforestation, I don't know what the name, Deforestation Act maybe, it seemed to be more accepted from trading partner side. And one issue they at least say, must admit I don't know the details of the UK Act. They say that these very detailed geolocalization thing is a huge of a problem, because then in the end you need digital tracking, and that's as well technically a problem. Maybe you know more about the UK Act and what one could learn or could have learned, maybe it's over, from its design.
I don't know the UK Act in any detail, but I could reply as follows. One of the biggest complaints from the EU's trading partners is about the geolocalization system being applied by the EU through, I suppose, Copernicus or so on to geomap the areas of deforestation and then classify the countries into what high risk, medium risk, or low risk countries and regions. Yeah. And indeed, there are complaints that this requires IT equipment and software and hardware and sensors and so on, which they don't have within reach very often. And secondly, that it's a very blunt instrument. It's incapable of correctly mapping deforestation in temperate zones. It just doesn't work, photographically speaking. So the Canadians are very insistent that doesn't work, as are, by the way, Finland and Sweden. Yeah? They're really unhappy with this. They think it will not work scientifically. So I can only assume that the UK Act has a more user-friendly and flexible approach to identifying areas that have been recently deforested. But what that approach is, technically speaking, I don't know.